Hello everyone, and welcome to this Prehistoric Experiences video on the Prehistoric Timeline. I'm Sarah and I will be guiding you through the last 4 million years of history. So, what's the first thing that springs to mind when someone says Stone Age? Is it dinosaurs chasing cavemen? Saber-toothed tigers? People dressed like this? Well, maybe, but actually there's a lot more to the Stone Age than that. Depending on who you ask, the Stone Age is 4 or even 7 million years long. Now, that's an enormous number to get your head round. So to make it a bit easier, why don't we use a bit of string? This bit of string represents the last 4 million years, from the beginning of the Lower Paleolithic all the way up to now, modern times. Now, depending on who you ask, some people say the Stone Age even began 7 million years ago. That's because we keep discovering new ancestors to humans, and that pushes the timeline back further and further. But 4 million years is a bit more simple, so we'll stick with that. Just to put it in perspective, if I wanted this bit of rope to carry on far enough back to show dinosaurs, it would have to be nearly half a mile long. Dinosaurs died out 64 million years ago, so I'm afraid cavemen and dinosaurs never met. This bit of rope is about 34 of my steps long. That means that each 7.5 steps represents 1 million years. The Paleolithic takes up a huge amount of the timeline. In fact, it goes all the way from here to here. This is the end of the Upper Paleolithic and the beginning of the Mesolithic. Humans like us are now the only humans left on Earth. Now, because the Paleolithic is so long, we've chopped that into bits as well to make it a bit easier to understand. So the Upper Paleolithic is the bit where humans like us appear. That goes from here back about 200,000 years to about here. From here back to those spears, that's the Middle Paleolithic. That's when we've got Neanderthals, Homo erectus and Denisovans. Everything that side of the spears is Lower Paleolithic. It's enormous. I've come back down to the beginning of the Lower Paleolithic to talk about our earliest ancestors. Now, if you'd come back to Africa, say, 4 million years ago, you wouldn't have bumped into humans like us. Probably not even animals that you would recognise as particularly human. They probably looked more like some of the sorts of monkeys we're familiar with from our own time, like chimpanzees and gorillas. We don't know a lot about them because it was so long ago, but some of them walked on 2 legs, some of them walked on all 4s, and they probably didn't really use tools yet. They might have used hammer stones to break open nuts, to break open bones and things, but we're not really sure. Now, interestingly, one of the things that we can use as evidence from our own time is that monkeys in modern times are having their own Stone Age. It's pretty cool. There are monkeys in South America that have been using stones to bash open Brazil nuts for thousands of years. We find the hammer stones lying on the ground. There was a monkey recently that sharpened a rock and tried to escape from a zoo. It's very cool. Now, back down here, your earliest ancestors, we've got people like Orrorin tugenensis, who's actually a bit further back than this. He's more like 6 or 7 million years ago. We've got Australopithecus africanus, Australopithecus afarensis, Naledii, Sediba. We've got some with really funky names like Paranthropus boisei. He lived around for quite a long time. Big chompy jaws, was probably more of a vegetarian. Now, it's important to understand that one type of early human didn't just turn into another. It took thousands and thousands of years through a process called evolution. Hopefully you've heard of that. Now, it's quite hard to understand, but basically every animal that's born is born with a chance of having a little quirk. Now that quirk might be kind of useful, like really long legs that enable that particular animal to run faster. That's going to make that animal more likely to survive. That animal is more likely to have babies, which also have long legs. If that quirk is useful, then it's going to get passed on. And over time, maybe more and more of those animals are going to have long legs. The same thing happens with brain size. The same thing happens with our hands. The same thing happens with our teeth. Sometimes those quirks don't work and that animal dies out. Sometimes the quirks are very handy and they get carried on. Now, we're already more than 1 million years up the timeline and not a lot has really happened. Some of our ancestors are starting to move around more on 2 legs. They're coming down out of the trees, they're looking to other sources of food. But it's not until we get to about here that things really change. And it changes because of something that was going on thousands of miles away. We're now about 2.5 million years ago. We've got a species called Homo habilis living alongside other early humans. Now, we're not really sure how that came about, but Homo habilis is one of the first species to start using tools. It was probably an accident. You see, Homo habilis had a bit of a problem. Africa, where most of our ancestors were living at this time, started to suffer from a drought. And that was because there was an ice age happening. When an ice age happens, you get sheets of ice up to 1 mile thick, covering huge swathes of the earth. That's a lot of water. And what it basically means is that there's less rain to fall on other parts of the world. Trees become scarcer, vegetation gets scarcer, and our ancestors had to think of a new way to get food, and that way was meat. Now, they probably weren't hunting yet, but they were scavenging. You see, this tool is not for killing, it's for breaking into bones to get out the fatty marrow and brain. Using their newly evolved opposable thumbs and their brains, they were able to work out that a broken rock was sharper than a pebble, and they could use that edge to chip their way into the bones of big animals like rhinos, elephants and zebras that had been killed by other animals. Now, it's a funny thing, but that little change, those ancestors managing to get a little bit of meat in their diet, gave them enough extra energy to start evolving more quickly. And pretty soon, we've got better tools like this. This is an early hand axe. The one back there is known as a chopper core. You can see it's got straighter edges. It's a lot thinner, which means you can cut more accurately with it. It's still pretty crude, but it's already an improvement. And it hasn't really taken that long in the grand scheme of things. Now, this tool shows us that those ancestors were still scavenging, but that they were more efficient at it. By the time that these guys are getting to the carcass, there's meat on it. It's not just bones. We know that because that tool is useless at cutting meat. This one's pretty good at it. Now, we're still in the lower Paleolithic, but things are still happening. Ancestors are beginning to leave Africa. They're evolving to be taller, they're able to walk further, they're able to run faster. We've probably got people using basic spears. At this time, they're probably just sharpened sticks. We've probably even got people using fire. Now, the tools change again. You can see they're just an evolution of what went before, but they're getting a lot more beautiful. We're now about 1 million years ago. Various types of human have left Africa. Homo ergaster, Homo erectus have left Africa. We've colonised parts of Asia, parts of Europe. The first humans have reached Britain. Not quite humans like us, but you would recognise them as human. Homo heidelbergensis, and later on Neanderthals, with Homo erectus as well. This is one of the types of tools that were found on the North Norfolk coast. They're some of the oldest stone tools ever used in Britain. This is the Haysborough hand axe, or a copy of it anyway. We've also got this one. This is the sort used by Homo ergaster. one of the first ones to leave Africa. It's really quite elegant. Very finely made, nice fine point on it for picking apart the joints on big animals. Really sharp edges. Don't underestimate how effective these things are. We once took a deer apart with these, and it was better in some ways than a modern knife. They're really excellent tools. We've also got evidence of people using spears. From about 500,000 years ago, we've actually got wooden spears that have been preserved in mud at places like Clacton. And they were big, chunky, heavy things, which would probably have been quite hard to throw, but nevertheless effective weapons. Now, not long after that, we have the evolution of Neanderthals. They're probably what a lot of people think of when they think of cavemen. They think of these stupid, knuckle-dragging, brutish creatures sitting around going, ugh. And we now know that that is not true. In fact, that idea of Neanderthals comes from Victorian amateur archaeologists, and they made stuff up, basically. It's not based on a lot of evidence. We know they quite likely buried their dead. We know they looked after their elderly and their sick. We know they had musical instruments like this. This is based on a flute that was found in a cave in Bulgaria. The original was made of a cave bear bone, and some scientists are still refusing to admit that it might have been made by Neanderthals. And they say that these holes were just chew holes from the front teeth of a fox or a hyena or something, but it's nonsense. This is a flute. It's one of the world's first musical instruments. It's really hard to play and actually really hard to make as well. So that tells you something about how clever they were. Maybe the first one was made by chance, but the ones after that weren't. We also know they had some of the world's first jewellery. Not particularly sophisticated, but it means they had the ability to give symbolic meaning to things. They seem to have been particularly fond of cave bears. A lot of their jewellery was carnivore teeth, and we find articles made out of cave bear bones as well. Now, one of the things about that typical idea of, the uggy, stupid caveman that may be fairly close is the clothing. One thing we don't find from this bit of history is sewing needles. We do, however, have bone and antler spikes like this, which could easily have been used for poking holes in leather and tying it together. But it means it's pretty unlikely they had really nice clothes. But bearing in mind, it was an ice age. They can't have been running around in a loincloth or they'd have frozen, even though they were built for the cold. So the skin draped around them and tied around the middle is probably not far off what they were actually wearing. You can see their tools are slightly better as well. This is a Neanderthal hand axe. We call this a Mousterian hand axe. And it's beautifully thin. You've got this lovely serrated edge that acts like a meat saw or a meat cleaver. You can chop with the point. It's a very, very efficient tool. In fact, if I'm cutting up a deer, I prefer this to a modern metal knife. They also worked out a really clever way of producing the first spearheads. And we know they did that because we found bits of glue with the imprint of these kinds of flakes on. What you do is you make something that looks like a big chunky hand axe, you hit it at just the right angle on one end, and the whole top of the hand axe pops off, giving you a flake that's flat on one side and just very slightly domed on the other, and it's razor sharp. A perfect tool for slicing up meat. Now, we're very lucky in Britain that we get a good number of finds from this bit of the Stone Age. We find hand axes, we've even found preserved wooden spears, which is really cool. But we don't find a lot from this next bit of the Stone Age, for the simple reason that Britain was under ice. Yep, another ice age. When people say the Ice Age, they make it sound as though there was only one. Actually, there were about 12 just on this 4 million years of string. And there's another one here, there's one there, there's another one up here. Each one lasting a few tens of thousands of years, and each one driving human beings out of Britain and into warmer parts of Europe. When humans like us first reached Europe and Asia, it was the middle of an ice age. It was really tough to survive. I mean, look at us, we are a tropical animal. We're not very hairy. We're not built for the cold. We're long and tall, which is very good in a hot environment, but not very good in an ice age. It wasn't until people started staying in larger groups and working together and specialising in specific skills that things really started to change. Let me try and explain how that works. Now, if you've got a group of people and everyone in the tribe is just trying to do a bit of everything, they're just trying to survive day to day, nobody's going to get brilliant at any one thing. Whereas if one person says, my thing is going to be making flint tools, and they just concentrate on that, suddenly the whole tribe has access to better tools. That means that somebody else can specialise in making better spears, and suddenly you can hunt better and more efficiently. That means that everyone else has more free time to do other things like making better clothing, working out new ways of preserving food, making better shelters, working out which plants can give you medicine. And suddenly we see this explosion in art and in human culture. We get beads, we get decorated things. We get people staying in one place for not a long time, but a few years at a time, and really developing a tribe. The funny thing is, if there hadn't been an ice age, we might never have got to see all this stuff at all. And that's because during an ice age, there are generally fewer trees. Because it's drier, all the water is trapped in the form of ice in these great ice sheets covering the whole of northern Europe. And that means that a lot more things have to be made of harder, longer lasting materials like stone, bone, ivory, antler, rather than wood. And that means they stand a better chance of being preserved, especially if they were dropped inside caves or rock overhangs, which is where a lot of our ancestors were still living, although they probably built some kind of hut or windbreak inside that shelter. In the Upper Paleolithic, we start to see people measuring time as well. This bit here is someone's attempt at recording the cycles of the moon. And it may sound like a small thing, we take it for granted in the modern world because we've got watches, we've got clocks, we've got our mobiles everywhere. But being able to predict when the seasons are going to change, being able to measure how long it takes to get from one place to another is really, really important. Once people could understand the passage of time and the passage of the seasons in a more predictable and detailed way, it put them in control of planning ahead and understanding when winter was likely to come. It meant they could be prepared for what the future might hold. And that's something that our species is much better at than some of the species that went before. We start to see the beginnings of some kind of religion. We'll never really know exactly what they believed, but it seems that they worshipped female fertility, or we think of them as mother figures. And the idea is, as far as we know, that this represented Earth in some way. It represented their idea of God. And these little figurines, although they may seem a little funny because, you know, big naked lady, they represent motherhood. They represent all that the Earth can provide for the people that live on it. If you think about it, Earth sort of is like our mother. We wouldn't exist without it. It gives us food, it gives us water, it gives us the things we need to make our clothing, it gives us a place to live. And for these people, that would have been even more obvious because everything they needed had to come from nature, one way or another. The idea of jewellery probably started in the Middle Paleolithic with Neanderthals, but it really reaches its height with modern humans. We start to see fantastic burials with literally thousands of beads in them. And it's a funny thing. Why, when we're trying to survive in a really difficult Ice Age environment, would we spend so much time making beads? Well, basically, it's a way of showing our status. It means if we can afford to have if we can afford to spend time making something so pointless, basically, it shows that we are a very organised tribe. We're a tribe that everyone would want to join, and it means we can maybe pick and choose who we let join depending on what skills they have. We start to see more advanced bone working as well. People are not just making big tools for killing things. This is a bone harpoon point for spearing fish and seals and that sort of thing. We start to get really delicate small things as well, like this. This is a really important invention. In fact, I would say it's probably one of the most important inventions that humans have ever come up with. Without clothing, we would not have survived the Ice Age environment that we found ourselves in. Without clothing, we would not be able to live in the parts of the world that we live in today. We also start to see some really clever ways of using flint. Now, in the middle and lower Paleolithic, if you wanted to make a tool, you need quite a large piece of flint to be able to make a hand axe. But during this time, people developed ways which are way more portable and way more efficient as well. This is a blade core, and these lines down here are really important because what it means is I can hit any of these little pointy bits on the top here and it will pop another blade off. That'll leave 2 more lines behind, and I can just keep going round and round and round until all I've got left is that. Now, some of the ones people were able to produce were really beautiful and long and thin. They make brilliant knives and spear points and that kind of thing. Some of them could be made into saws, and even the smaller ones could be made into arrowheads. One of the other things that really changes during the Upper Paleolithic is the type of hunting tools we have available. You might call them weapons, I think of them more as tools. In the Middle Paleolithic, you had to get quite close to what you were hunting in order to kill it. There are theories that you even had to climb onto it, a bit like riding a rodeo bull, and sort of distract it and torment it while your mates go and spear it. That is extremely dangerous. Throughout this period, people start to develop better tools, better weapons. And one of the really crucial inventions are new types of spears. This is the end of a 2-piece spear, and the idea is that this short piece fits into a much longer piece and it slips out. So when this goes into the animal runs off, the long straight stick that's taken a lot of work to make falls to the ground, and you can pick it up later. In an Ice Age situation where you've got very little wood about, it's actually quite a hard thing to make, a nice long straight spear, so this is a really good invention. As time goes on and we get more into the Mesolithic, we start to get bows and arrows. Now, I'd love to know how someone came up with the idea for that. Again, probably by accident, but bows started to become more and more useful as the Ice Age ended and we get into a more forested kind of landscape in the Mesolithic. Bows are not so good if you want to kill something from a long way away, at least not prehistoric bows. These are for hunting in dense woodland where you can sneak up really close to your prey and get a really accurate shot. Now, the first arrows weren't like the kind of arrowheads you might think of from cartoons and picture books. Now, you remember this little tiny blade core? Some of these tiny, tiny flints that we could get even off this little one would be useful for making arrowheads because we make them like this. You can see the arrowhead itself is really tiny, and then we've got little tiny flint barbs stuck in down the side. And the idea is that when that goes into the animal, it's going to cause a lot of damage. And if any of these flints get broken, it's not a problem. We simply melt the glue, take the old barb out, put a new one in, and the whole thing's repaired in just a few minutes. That's much, much better than having to spend an hour or two napping a whole new flint-tipped spear. Another invention that we really take for granted in the modern world is handles. Now, attaching a tool to a handle was something that people hadn't always done. Neanderthals did it a bit, they put spearheads on spears, but we really developed it into a technology. Now, you wouldn't think it was that important, but if I hold this tool in my hand, there's a limit to what I can do with it. I can't get much force behind it, my hand's going to get sore. it's not very good. If I've got a handle on it, I can hit more accurately, I can get more force behind it, and it works in a way which works better with the muscles of my arms. It means I can use it more effectively. I can start cutting bits of wood down, I can start carving more complicated things. This tool and this tool would be the sort of things that someone would use to carve a bow. You'd use this one to cut it down and this one to shape it. This is an adze and this is an axe. If you've been learning about Starcar, which is a very famous Mesolithic village in Yorkshire, you might have seen things like this. This is possible evidence of a kind of ceremonial headdress. Now, some people think this was a hunting disguise, so you'd put this on your head and it would make your silhouette look more deer-like so that the deer didn't realise you were there. But to be honest, I think these were for some kind of ceremonial use or ritual, as archaeologists like to say when they don't know what something was for. The original ones have big holes drilled here, which would enable you to tie it onto your head. Maybe they were for dancing, maybe they were for visiting the spirit world. We don't know. But either way, they were very special. The Mesolithic lasted from about the end of the last ice age until around about 5,000 years ago. The thing that really changed our way of life at that point was the invention of farming. That was a huge change. It meant that people were staying still, they were staying in one place, they were making what we would know as a village. And rather than just taking what nature happened to give them that year, they were trying to take control of it and forge their own future. With the introduction of farming, people needed to be able to clear the land for growing crops, and that meant new types of flint technology. This is a flint axe of the type used in the early Neolithic. It's kind of similar to the Mesolithic axes, but it's got a bigger cutting edge. And this would go into a nice strong handle that you can actually chop pretty effectively with. But by the end of the Neolithic, people had started polishing their axes, and that was another big change because it means that this stone axe can cut almost like metal. We also get things like this. This beautiful Neolithic dagger would have gone in a really ornate handle and would probably have been used for special ceremonies or special occasions. It's not the kind of thing you'd use for chopping up your vegetables, but they are beautiful, very finely made, perfectly straight edge. It takes a lot of skill to be able to do that. We also get some really fancy arrowheads. Now, in the early Neolithic, arrowheads are fairly simple. They're what we call leaf-shaped arrowheads, so they are that sort of shape, like a tiny miniature hand axe, but very thin and finely made. But throughout the Neolithic, they kind of evolve into a whole variety of shapes, including ones like this. Now, this appears towards the end of the Neolithic and into the early Bronze Age, and this type was found near Stonehenge. Look at this really elegant tang here. That's a lot of skill to make that, and it probably wouldn't have lasted very long in use. You'd probably only get one shot out of that before it would break, especially if you hit a bone or something. We also start to get the first cloth and the first pottery, things that are recognisable in the modern world. Neolithic pottery isn't great stuff. It works fine for cooking in, but it doesn't last very long. It especially doesn't last very well in the ground, so it doesn't turn up very much at archaeological digs. When it does, it's often described as being like dog biscuit because it's so soft, so lightly fired that it's basically just dry mud, and it starts to dissolve in the ground. Of course, one of the most recognisable things from the Neolithic is what we call megalithic tombs. Now, basically that means big stones. We start seeing monuments, lasting changes made to the land, people building ditches, building walls, and things like Stonehenge. About 4,000 years ago, we come to what's known as the Calcalithic Age, or Copper Age. Now, that didn't really happen in Britain. We skipped straight to the Bronze Age, but in parts of Europe, someone, for some reason, had the bright idea of putting this rock, malachite, in a fire. I don't know why they did it, I don't know what they were hoping to do, but what would have happened is that the fire would have gone green. That must have been terrifying for people who've never seen a fire go odd colours before. They wouldn't have fireworks like us. And when the fire had gone out and they fished around trying to work out what had gone on, they will have found little pieces of this. This is copper, the first metal to be used by people. Copper is very soft, you can hammer it into shapes as well as pouring it into moulds. And people started making it into tools. This little axe is a copy of the axe that was found on Ötzi the Iceman. He's a Copper Age man who was murdered 4,500 years ago and left up the mountain. He became mummified in the ice and his body was found in about 1992. The find of his axe pushed the origin of these axes back another 1,000 years or so. Around that time, we also start to get these axes. Now, this is a flint axe, but can you see? They've made it the same shape as the copper axe. And I think probably what was happening is the flint knappers were trying to keep up with this new technology. You see, metal is very hard work to make. You've got to dig the rock out of the ground, you've got to grind the rock up, you've got to build a really big hot fire and melt the copper out, and then you've got to shape it into your tools. Whereas a skilled flint knapper can make one of these in a couple of hours. This one is an original, and at some point it would have been polished all over. This would have been a fantastic cutting tool, but at some point someone broke the end off it and gave up using it. But it's a wonderful example of one technology merging into another. Now, copper is not brilliant by itself. It's a very pretty metal. It's a lovely, warm, rosy pink. It's what the pipes in your house might be made of. But it's not very hard. It doesn't hold a particularly good edge. In fact, I'd probably still stick with flint myself. But it didn't take long for people to think, well, if there's one rock that can give us a metal, maybe there are others. And it wasn't long before people threw this rock in a fire. This is called cassiterite, and it's where we get tin. Now, tin is even softer than copper. It's a beautiful silvery colour, you can use it to make mirrors, but it's rubbish for making tools. But here's the thing, if you mix this metal with this metal, you get bronze. And that led to the beginning of the Bronze Age. Now, when we talk about the Bronze Age and the Copper Age and the Iron Age, it makes it sound as though one ended and the other one began, like that. But it wasn't like that at all. Things overlapped by hundreds of years. Some people kept on using flint, some people had copper, and it changed far more slowly than people imagine. Bronze is very, very useful for tools, and around this time we see this huge explosion of woodworking tools. We can see houses being built with really complicated joints, all because people have got better axes and better chisels, better wood turning tools even. But we also start to see something a bit less pleasant. Only 300 years or so after the invention of bronze, we start seeing swords. Now, a sword is a beautiful thing. It looks like a piece of the sun. It must have seemed like some incredible magical item to people living at that time. But its only real purpose is murder. You can't chop vegetables with it. You can't chop firewood with it. You can't hunt with it. It is purely a weapon for killing other people. We used to think that bronze swords were really just for showing off, but we now know they were actually used in battle. And that really sets the scene for the Iron Age and all of the ages that come after, where we see people fighting over things much more. You can see that as soon as humans like us arrive on Earth, things start happening more quickly. The Mesolithic is shorter than the Paleolithic, the Neolithic is even shorter than that, and the Bronze Age just lasts a few thousand years. All we're left with on the end is this bit of string, the last couple of thousand years. All of the history that you will learn in the rest of your time at school fits into this bit of rope. We've got the Iron Age and the Celts and the Romans. We've got the Saxons, the Vikings, the Normans, the medieval period, the Tudor period, Henry VIII and his wives. We've got the Wars of the Roses. We've got Queen Elizabeth I, the Spanish Armada. We've got the Stuarts and the plot to blow up Parliament. We've got King Charles getting his head chopped off. We've got the Georgians and the French Revolution, Marie Antoinette saying, "Let them eat cake." We've got Nelson and Napoleon blowing each other up with huge ships. We've got the Regency period, Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters. We've got the Victorian period, the Edwardians who invented the bicycle. We've got World War I, World War II, the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, with the really good music and terrible hairdos, the 90s when some of your parents were born, and now. All of that just fits into this little tiny bit on the end. It's no wonder people struggle to live in the modern world sometimes. We're all still stuck in the Stone Age, really. There we go, I hope that was useful. Before you go though, just remember, almost all of the time that humans like us have been on Earth has been Stone Age. If you want to understand human beings, you need to understand Stone Age human beings first. It's what made us who we are. I always think it's one of the reasons that perhaps people have a hard time living in the modern world. We haven't evolved for it yet. We're still just Stone Age people at heart.